Hey there, friends! So, this past October, when the world was young and people still gathered together in large groups, myself and a few friends had the pleasure to catch George R.R. Martin himself being interviewed live at the Chicago Humanities Festival by author Eve L. Ewing. We actually had the chance to submit questions for George beforehand via email, which the interviewer would then choose from. Little did I expect my question to get chosen, especially since there only turned out to have been 4 audience questions chosen. But as you can guess from the title of this video, I was very lucky, and my question was chosen, and my stupid internet name was indeed read aloud before the man himself. If I had been sitting a little closer, perhaps I would have thought to flail my hands in the air or something, but perhaps for the better, I was sitting towards the back in stunned silence, as Eve Ewing said something about Lucifer means Lightbringer while sitting next to George R.R. Martin. That was thrilling. The footage for the event took a while to be released, and I was in the middle of a move then, excuses, so I'm a bit late getting to bringing this to you, but what I have for you here is my question, George's answers, he gave 2 of them, and then a bit of elaboration for me about what I think he was talking about. Anyway, let's get right to it. Here's my question.
Okay, another question. This is from Lucifer means Lightbringer, which I also presume is not this person's government name. You have created several notable in-world mythical figures, which seem to serve as archetypes that are the main characters echo at times. Can you say a few words about your use of myth and internal folklore and the way those things interact with the main story and characters?
Yeah, I've had a lot of fun. Well, it's part of the world-building process. I mean, every world, every culture has its myths, has its legends, has its heroes. I suspect everybody in this room, even if you haven't read the books or something, knows who Robin Hood was, or a little about him, or King Arthur, or maybe some of the American myths, Paul Bunyan.
Or Spider-Man or Superman.
Right, right. And we refer to them occasionally. We make references to them. It's sometimes amazing to think of the extent to which some of these ancient myths and ancient characters permeate our culture. You know, we watch football and somebody blows out his Achilles tendon. We're referring to a character from Homer, who existed, if he existed at all, 3,000 years ago. And, his only vulnerability was his heel. And because of that, we're talking about an injury to a football player. It's amazing. So a mythical world, obviously I can't reference Achilles or Paul Bunyan or Spider-Man, but it has to have its own heroes and its own legends. And I try to put them in to give that flavor.
And indeed he does. We're all thinking of Azor Ahai, of course, who is both ancient hero and prophesied savior. People are already openly comparing Daenerys to Azor Ahai. For example, in A Dance with Dragons, Halden Halfmaester is reporting the words of Benero, the High Priest of R'hllor, back to Tyrion, and he says, "Benero has sent forth a word from Volantis. Her coming is the fulfillment of an ancient prophecy. From smoke and salt she was born to make the world anew. She is Azor Ahai returned, and her triumph over darkness will bring a summer that will never end. Death itself will bend its knee, and all those who die fighting in her cause shall be reborn." Indeed, Daenerys did wake dragons from stone beneath a bleeding star. As prophetic fulfillments go, that's pretty much a home run. We know Melisandre has been trying to trot out Stannis as Azor Ahai Reborn for several books now, although there are signs that she will soon be seeing Jon Snow as fitting the bill, as she famously says in A Dance with Dragons that, "I pray for a glimpse of Azor Ahai, and R'hllor shows me only snow. No to the capital S snow." I suspect that Jon's rebirth will have a few more fireworks than on the show, if you will, and we'll probably see some things that could fit the born or reborn under a bleeding star, and waking dragons from stone lines from the prophecy. Going back a bit further, we find people like Rhaegar Targaryen, Aemon Targaryen, and Bloodraven spending a lot of time and effort to discern who the prince that was promised might be, with Rhaegar even trying to conceive a magic baby when a comet came passing by. So close, Rhaegar, so close. But it's not just Azor Ahai and matters of the fate of the world. George uses his in-world mythology to enhance the storytelling in far more casual ways than people talking about who is the promised prince or savior. Take this passage from A Game of Thrones, which comes as Ned is trying to puzzle out the riddle of the illegitimate parentage of Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen. He opened to the section on House Lannister once more and turned the pages slowly, hoping against hope that something would leap out at him. The Lannisters were an old family, tracing their descent back to Lan the Clever, a trickster from the Age of Heroes who was no doubt as legendary as Bran the Builder, though far more beloved of singers and tale-tellers. In the songs, Lan was the fellow who winkled the Casterlys out of Casterly Rock with no weapon but his wits, and stole gold from the sun to brighten his curly hair. Ned wished he were here now to winkle the truth out of this damnable book. George is managing to simultaneously build up the mystique of the clever Lannisters Ned is trying to out-scheme here, as well as simply using as clever as Lan as an in-world colloquialism for someone who is exceedingly bright. I've noticed that George almost always slips his world building in without it becoming distracting, and he does that by using the world building to serve the main plot, as he does here. He doesn't have some character just start info dumping on Lan the Clever and that whole mythology. He simply drops Lan's name in to highlight the game of wits going on here between Ned and the Lannisters. And in doing so, he tells us a bit about House Lannister and makes the overall world seem richer. As a comparison for Lan the Clever, George has Eddard mention Bran the Builder, a figure that we're already familiar with by this time. This establishes in the mind of the reader that each great house is likely to have some sort of mythical figure associated with it, and that those figures inform us about the tendencies of the characters from that house. The Lannisters are rather clever, although not always wise, and I think that given the reveal that young Bran Stark will end up as some sort of king at the end of a story where most of Westeros has probably been destroyed by then, we can in retrospect see Bran the Builder as foreshadowing of what King Bran's primary kingly role will be to help rebuild Westeros. George also uses his in-world myth to enhance storytelling in darker ways. One thinks of Bran's terrifying night at the Night Fort, where all of Old Nan's scariest stories come to life as the leaves and branches rustle and stir in the chill winter wind. His eyes opened. What was that? He held his breath. Did I dream it? Was I having a stupid nightmare? He didn't want to wake Mira and Jojen for a bad dream, but there, a soft scuffling sound far off. Leaves. It's leaves rattling off the walls outside and rustling together. Or the wind. It could be the wind. The sound wasn't coming from outside, though. Bran felt the hairs on his arm start to rise. The sound's inside. It's in here with us, and it's getting louder. He pushed himself up onto an elbow, listening. There was wind and blowing leaves as well, but this was something else. Footsteps. Someone was coming this way. Something was coming this way. It wasn't the Sentinels, he knew. The Sentinels never left the wall. But there might be other ghosts in the Night Fort, ones even more terrible. He remembered what old Nan had said of Maddax, how he took his boots off and prowled the castle halls barefoot in the dark, with never a sound to tell you where he was except for the drops of blood that fell from his axe and his elbows and the end of his wet red beard. Or maybe it wasn't Maddax at all. Maybe it was the thing that came in the night. The Prentice boys all saw it, old Nan said, but afterward when they told their Lord Commander, every description had been different. And 3 died within the year, and the 4th went mad, and 100 years later, when the thing had come again, the Prentice boys were seen shambling along behind it, all in chains. That was only a story, though. He was just scaring himself. There was no thing that came in the night. Maester Luwin had said so. If there had ever been such a thing, it was gone from the world now, like giants and dragons. It's nothing, Bran thought. But the sounds were louder now. It's coming from the well, he realized. That made him even more afraid. Something was coming up from under the ground, coming up from out of the dark. Hodor woke it up. He woke it up with that stupid piece of slate, and now it's coming. It was hard to hear over Hodor's snores and the thumping of his own heart. Was that the sound blood made dripping from an axe? Or was it the faint, far-off rattling of ghostly chains? Bran listened harder. Footsteps. It was definitely footsteps, each one a little louder than the one before. He couldn't tell how many, though. The well made the sounds echo. He didn't hear any dripping, or chains either, but there was something else. A high, thin whimpering sound, like someone in pain, and heavy muffled breathing. But the footsteps were loudest. The footsteps were coming closer. Bran was too frightened to shout. The fire had burned down to a few faint embers, and his friends were all asleep. He almost slipped his skin and reached out for his wolf, but Summer might be miles away. He couldn't leave his friends helpless in the dark to face whatever was coming up out of the well. I told them not to come here, he thought miserably. I told them there were ghosts. I told them we should go to Castle Black. That was George R.R. Martin hitting us with the full force of his in-world myth-making, all bent towards the purpose of bringing Bran's terrifying Nightfort experience to life. Not only does George mention Mad Axe, the thing that came in the night, and the 79 Sentinels here, just a few paragraphs earlier, Bran was thinking of the Night King and the Rat Cook, who roasted people alive and baked them into food in the very Nightfort kitchen in which the company is staying. Isn't that lovely? George is also building upon the waking something deep within the earth by dropping a stone down a well terror that is already established by the Lord of the Rings, of course. Hodor dropping a stone down the Nightfort well is meant to evoke the hobbits dropping a stone down the well shaft at the mines of Moria, which of course woke the hideous demon known as the Balrog. And this only adds to the terror that the reader experiences along with Bran as he hears something coming up out of the well. George turns this into comedy, of course, when the horrible thing emerges and turns out not to be Mad Axe or the Balrog, but Samwell Tarly, which is kind of a stroke of storytelling genius, if you ask me. George is constantly doing things like this to undercut the seriousness of his in-world mythology. I mean, no legend or fable is ever presented without someone else declaring it to be of dubious origin or saying, well, those are only stories, though. And sometimes they are only stories, or at least exaggerations. But other times, the monsters are real, such as the undead thing which Sam and Bran come to know as Cold Hands. And that's the good monster, the one who is coming to their aid against the even worse monsters, the Whites and the White Walkers, who step right off the pages of Westerosi legend and onto the pages of A Song of Ice and Fire proper. Another great example of the way that George uses his myth-making to build up the characters of the main story comes in A Clash of Kings, when Catelyn Stark is on the way to treat with the competing brother kings, Stannis and Renly Baratheon. Despite Catelyn's logical proposals, the brothers are famously stubborn and will hear neither Cat's arguments nor each other's, leading to an impending battle between the two. But to build up that idea of stubborn Baratheons, George has Cat ponder the legendary tale of Durin Godsgrief and the founding of Storm's End as she is on the way to Storm's End to meet them. I won't quote the entire tale here, but the basic idea is that Durin somehow stole the daughter of the wind and sea gods, Elenai, for his wife, and then built a big castle on the bay to celebrate. The angry gods smote everyone at the wedding, save for Durin and Elenai, with Elenai saving her husband with her divine power. Durin was defiant, of course, and we read that 5 more castles he built, each larger and stronger than the last, only to see them smashed asunder when the gale winds came howling up Shipbreaker Bay, driving great walls of water before them. His lords pleaded with him to build inland. His priests told him he must placate the gods by giving Elenai back to the sea. Even his small folk begged him to relent. Durin would have none of it. A 7th castle he raised, most massive of all. Though the angry gods threw storm after storm against it, the 7th castle stood defiant, and Durin Godsgrief and fair Elenai dwelt there together until the end of their days. Catelyn then observes Storm's End itself, which looks like a spiked fist atop an upthrust arm, which is even more language of defiance, right down to the visual description. And then her servant is all like, hey look, it's Stannis. It's so much more effective than having Catelyn simply muse that the Baratheon brothers were legendary for their recalcitrance, or whatever line that some lesser author would write. Instead, we're given the mythical backstory of Durin Godsgrief and Storm's End, which is a hefty piece of world building in its own right, and it's seamlessly blended into the narrative as Cat approaches this showdown with the warring kings who could turn their armies against her sons in the near future. It's not hard to see that George is encouraging the reader to draw parallels between the uber-defiant Durin Godsgrief and the uber-stubborn Baratheon brothers, between the tricksy Lannisters and the trickster Lan the Clever, between the minuscule yet prolific Bran the Builder and our own boy wizard and eventual Summer King Brandon Stark. As I mentioned, it's far more than simply sussing out that both Jon and Dany are likely to fulfill the prophecies of Azor Ahai Reborn and the Prince That Was Promised in some sense. George is constantly comparing his main characters to their mythical counterparts, and by doing so, those myths become more than myths. They become archetypes. An archetype is defined as the original pattern or model from which all things of the same kind are copied or on which they are based. A model or first form, a prototype. In Jungian psychology, which is highly relevant here, an archetype is understood as a collectively inherited unconscious idea, pattern of thought, image, etc., universally present in individual psyches. During God's Grief is the archetype or prototype of a Baratheon, defiant, strong, egotistical, and a bit foolish. And all the Baratheon brothers we get in the story, Robert, Stannis, and Renly, exemplify most or all of these traits. The same goes for Lan the Clever, or Bran the Builder, or other mythical figures like the valiant and chivalrous Galadon of Morn, the hero and moral example for Brienne of Tarth, or even the brave and resourceful Clarence Crabbe, who inspires the lovable rogue Nimble Dick Crabbe of Cracklaw Point. May he rest in peace.
Grabbing on Cracklaw like my name was Clarence. Nimble Dick Crabbe running interference on any bloody mama that is apparent, because for Cracklaw men there ain't no fair.
As you can see, these symbolic archetypes are fantastic because they serve so many purposes. If George's legends simply stayed in the past, they would still act as colorful world building and they'd still be interesting in their own right. But when they serve as archetypes for the characters in the main story, they help flesh out and define those characters, creating a sense of history come to life, or of the past coming around again, and I think that's exactly what George wants to evoke. That's why I phrased my question the way I did, and here it is again.
You have created several notable in-world mythical figures, which seem to serve as archetypes that are the main characters echo at times. Can you say a few words about your use of myth and internal folklore and the way those things interact with the main story and characters?
Yeah, I've had a lot of fun.
I thought it was very notable that he began his answer with, "Yeah, I've had a lot of fun." I mean, indeed he has, right? Let it be known, George R. R. Martin enjoys creating mythology and world building. Newsflash. I hope with some of these quick examples I gave here that I managed to highlight some of the ways in which he does this, and does so brilliantly. Best of all, George's answer doesn't stop there. He goes on to talk about the way in which his in-world historical figures function much the same way as the mythical figures do, and about the way in which his historical figures become mythicized.
I had a lot of, I don't know how many of you have read my latest Westeros book, Fire and Blood, which is, thank you. Fire and Blood is a little different because it's not part of A World of Ice and Fire, A Song of Ice and Fire. It's a fake history book, imaginary history, about the first 150 years of the Targaryen dynasty. And it's written in world, it's written by Archmaester Gildane at a citadel, 300 years after many of the events which he's chronicling. So like a real historian, like someone writing now about the American Revolution, well, he wasn't there for the American Revolution. He has to go back and look at primary sources. So did Archmaester Gildane. And what you find out when you do that is the primary sources disagree. They have different versions of events. One person said it happened this way. Another person said, no, that never happened. It happened this way. And Archmaester Gildane, trying to be a good historian, is replicating all of the different versions. And that was a lot of fun for me because I could play with the whole concept of history being told by the winners, history being cleaned up and made politically correct or religiously correct, and I could present different versions of the various stories, and I enjoyed that, and I think some of my readers enjoyed that too, particularly the version of history told by Mushroom, the court fool, who always told everything in the most sexual, lascivious, and shocking way possible, usually with himself as the hero.
And you have a history degree, so that was helpful.
Well, not a history degree, but
A history minor.
A history minor, and I love history. I read a lot of. I'm not a historian by any means. I'm just a history nerd, I suppose you would say.
Now, two of the historical figures which become mythicized on the pages of Fire and Blood are Aegon the Conqueror and Maegor the Cruel, who are kind of two opposite ends of the spectrum as far as kingship goes, but who both nevertheless helped build the Targaryen dynasty. Daenerys thinks of Aegon the Conqueror and her brother Rhaegar Targaryen as role models more than anyone else, and she's not above dropping Maegor's name when need be either. She lifted her head. "And I am Daenerys Stormborn, Daenerys of House Targaryen, of the blood of Aegon the Conqueror and Maegor the Cruel, and old Valeria before them. I am the dragon's daughter, and I swear to you, these men will die screaming. Now bring me to Khal Drogo." Now, in the interest of context, Dany is evoking Maegor's name to swear bloody vengeance upon Cal Jago after learning about the horrible things that he and his men did to Aroa, who was the girl that Dany saved earlier in that book. As you can see, Dany is drawing upon the terror invoked by Aegon at the Field of Fire, the horror of Maegor's entire reign, and even the unspeakable horror of old Valyria in this moment to describe the wrath that she feels for those who victimize her people. That's quite the reputation to be able to draw on there. I mean, even though Dany has just lost Drogo's Khalasar, doesn't have her dragons yet, and is basically powerless in this moment, her words still carry weight, as she is indeed the last scion of those draconic bloodlines. A dance with dragons left off with Dany facing down Cal Jago, thankfully with Drogon at her side, a full-grown Drogon, so we'll have to see what happens in the Winds of Winter. And of course, don't miss the Winds of Winter preview video that I did with Quinn from Quinn's Ideas on this very topic for more. Most importantly, Maegor's name carries weight in the mind of the reader because it's already been mentioned twice before Dany drops it here. It's cleverly done in non-Daenerys chapters, however. George has both Catelyn and Ned think of the old stories about Maegor the Cruel, who murdered all the masons who labored on his castle so they might never reveal its secrets when they come to King's Landing and the Red Keep. Ned actually thinks of Maegor's cruelty when he's thrown in the black cells of the Red Keep, which works very well to enhance the morbid dread of Ned's imprisonment in that moment, but also sets up Dany dropping Maegor's name later in that same book. In the end, comparing Dany to Aegon the Conqueror or Maegor the Cruel, or to her brother Rhaegar or her father the Mad King, works much the same way that comparing Tyrion and Cersei Lannister to Lan the Clever does. Thus you can see why George saw it as a natural pivot to move from discussing the shadow that his in-world legends and myths cast on the main story to discussing the way that recent history is mythicized as it is set down in the quote history books by the Maesters. I think it's pretty clear that anytime we're reading the fake history in George's quote-unquote supplemental materials like Fire and Blood or Dunk and Egg, we should be thinking about the main story of Ice and Fire and looking to draw comparisons between the characters. Even before Fire and Blood or The World of Ice and Fire, George is showing us history turning into myth and legend in real time as the stories of Daenerys the Conqueror begin to spread. In A Feast for Crows, several acolytes of the Citadel are discussing rumors of Daenerys, saying, "The Mad King's daughter is alive, and she's hatched herself 3 dragons." One fellow says, "Dragons in Ashai, dragons in Karth, dragons in Meereen, Dothraki dragons freeing slaves, each telling differs from the last." While another answers, "Only in the details, all speak of dragons, and a beautiful young queen." Quentyn Martell, on the other hand, who's on his way to try to marry Daenerys and win her to the Dornish side, hears all kinds of horrible things about her. The more Quentyn heard of Daenerys Targaryen, the more he feared that meeting. The young Kaei claimed that she fed her dragons on human flesh and bathed in the blood of virgins to keep her skin smooth and supple. Quentyn also hears tales of Dany's soldiers having foot-long members, which still cannot satisfy her lust, which is pure fancy, obviously, but he also hears that her cow killed her brother to make her queen. Then she killed her cow to make herself Khaleesi. She practices blood sacrifice, lies as easily as she breathes, turns against her own on a whim. She's broken truces, tortured envoys. Her father was mad too. It runs in the blood. And some of that is true. Drogo did kill Viserys, though not to make her queen, quote-unquote. Dany did kill Drogo, although that was a mercy killing after he went catatonic and wasn't done to make herself Khaleesi. She did sort of arguably double-cross the slavers of Meereen, although I'd argue that she didn't, and have in my Dany video titled Slay the Masters. She did sort of have her dragon singe the Tok'ra a bit of that younkish envoy, that's true, and of course her father was indeed mad. So as you can see, being a living legend can sort of cut both ways. However, the stories that horrify the upper class of the slave cities of Essos shine like a beacon to the downtrodden, as we hear in A Dance with Dragons from a Volantene customs officer. Behind the black wall, lords of ancient blood sleep poorly, listening as their kitchen slaves sharpen their long knives. Slaves grow our food, clean our streets, teach our young. They guard our walls, row our galleys, fight our battles. And now, when they look east, they see this young queen shining from afar, this breaker of chains. The old blood cannot suffer that. In this case, Dany's legend has gone before her and paved the way for a likely slave uprising in Volantis, which will probably work in her favor. And for more on that, check out the Winds of Winter video Quinn and I did titled burning Volantis. Jon Snow is also on his way to becoming something of a living legend. He's already lived among the wildlings and returned to tell the tale. He's led the Watch in a defense of Castle Black in the Wall when he wasn't even Lord Commander yet. He then rose to Lord Commander at an extremely young age. He's a skin changer with a huge albino wolf at his side, and he's about to be raised from the dead and eventually named both King of the North and Azor Ahai Reborn. No doubt his legend will spread throughout Westeros and reach the ears of someone like Daenerys long before the two fated heroes ever meet in person. Just as the legend of Daenerys the Dragonlord will roll through Westeros long before her armies ever do. Hanging over them all is the legend of legends in the A Song of Ice and Fire world, that of the Others and the Long Night. Here's a place where looking at George's myths and archetypes can actually shed some light, pun intended. Okay, so in the HBO show, we had the Night King, right? His horned majesty, the leader of the White Walkers and the author of the legendary "Come at me, Snow" meme. But in the books, there's no such distinctive leader of the Others and the army of the Whites. But there is a Night's King in the ancient legends, whose myth Bran recalls at the Night Fort. That original Night's King probably doesn't exist anymore, although who knows, right? Maybe he's lurking inside the Weirwood Net or something. But by looking at the Night King legend as an archetype, we can see other characters who could possibly step into that archetypal role in certain instances. That's a huge topic to crack open, so I'll refer you to my video called "The Long Night Was His to Rule," but I'll just briefly mention that characters who draw parallels to Night's King include both nobler figures like Jon Snow and Stannis Baratheon, as well as less noble folk like Euron Greyjoy, of course, and even historical figures like Aemond One-Eye Targaryen. I could certainly see Euron perhaps taking up the narrative space of the TV show Night King, stealing one of Dany's dragons, attacking Westeros, perhaps even triggering the fall of the Wall or the invasion of the Others, or both through dark sorcery. Or I could even see Euron somehow transforming into a true leader of the Others. Perhaps if his quest for magical power leads him to become some sort of vessel or tool for whatever cold magic moves the Others. Even Jon Snow, noble as he is, what if his dead body is temporarily body snatched by the Others, as Quinn and I discussed in our Jon the Wolfman video? What if his body is temporarily whited and he turns out to be the prince that was promised to the Others, some sort of twisted fulfillment of an ancient pact between the Starks and the Others? There is a certain amount of foreshadowing for something along these lines. The point is, George has created a Night King archetype, and so even if we don't have an equivalent to the TV show Night King as of yet, we should be looking for one, or more, to emerge, just as we're looking for Jon and Dany to emerge as incarnations of Azor Ahai Reborn. Thus, we can add yet another function to George's use of myth and archetype: prescience, or rather what we lit nerds call foreshadowing. And yes, that was a Dune joke. Alright, well I hope you enjoyed George's answers to my question and the follow-up discussion here. I'll close with a fun little question that someone asked George right after mine about what George likes these days, as it was really nice to just hear him sort of talk about some of the things he's been having fun with. Although I will remind you that this was recorded last fall before social distancing and all the rest that we are currently dealing with.
So I'm going to give our final question to someone named Adam Prestigiacomo, who wants to know what is something... Are you here? Oh, all right. What up? Did I say your last name sort of right? Great. Nailed it. Okay. Our good friend Adam wants to know what is something that makes you happy.
There
He's right there, so...
There are a lot of things that that make me happy. You know, I love books. Reading a good book makes me happy, especially, you know, I've been reading since I was a small kid. I still read voraciously. I read a chapter or two from a book almost every night. Every once in a while I pick up a book where I read that chapter or two and then I have to read another chapter and another chapter and another chapter. I wind up staying all night. I love it when that happens. I love good movies. I love good television shows, the kinds that get my hooks into me and I have to binge them all on Netflix. I actually kind of hate the concept of binging, but I find myself doing it anyway. As my waistline will testify, I love good food, especially, you know, I mean, Greek food in Chicago, opa opa. Great barbecue when I'm in Texas, in New Mexico, where I lived. I moved to New Mexico in 1979, and I can never leave because I became addicted to green chili. Which you can really only get in New Mexico. Someone there knows the truth of what I speak. And you'll probably all boo me for this, but of course, pizza in New York.
You know, it is what it is.
So I love all that. And I love writing my own stories, and particularly I love finishing them. I actually don't love, I mean, people say, do I enjoy writing?
No one likes writing.
I don't like writing. Writing is hard.
Writing sucks.
Writing, I'm constantly questioning myself. Every sentence I put down, I wonder whether it's good enough, or I reread what I wrote yesterday and I hate it. But when I actually finish a book, the rush that comes through me, it was easier to write short stories then, because then I would get that rush, every few weeks. But now I get that rush every, 8 years or something like that. But it's a great rush, and I'm hoping to have it again in the relatively near future when I finish Winds of Winter. But I do know that the day after I announce that, the day after Winds of Winter comes out, I'll get the first text saying, "When is Dream of Spring coming out?" So, these pleasures are temporary, but there's a lot of things I love, and I love the people in my life. I've been very fortunate. I have my wonderful wife, Paris, who unfortunately couldn't be with me on this trip. I have an amazing staff of minions who serve me. One of them, Sid, is here with me tonight, and 4 or 5 others are at home. They try to keep me working and try to keep distractions at bay. I love my publishers, David Munch, who didn't want me to come here, and and my editor, Ann Grohl, and my wonderful publishers at Bantam Doubleday Dell. So there's a lot of things that make me happy. Thank you.
All right, thanks everyone. Be sure to like and subscribe to Ye Old YouTube channel here if you haven't already. And feel free to share this video with your friends, of course. If you're looking for entertainment while you're staying home, then why not dive on into the Mythical Astronomy back catalog? We've chewed up many hours discussing myth, archetype, and symbol for your viewing pleasure if you enjoy that sort of thing. For the full video on George's interview at the Chicago Humanities Festival, check out the link in the description. So long, friends.